Hello again and welcome back. Tonight's video is going to be talking about using the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. Now I've included the actual formula here, and this is the quadratic formula. It's going to be available on any formula sheet you see that's for math usually, especially the Algebra 1, so you don't have to memorize this normally, but you do need to know how to use it. And we use this formula to solve quadratic equations and find the zeros, roots, solutions, solution sets, and the x-intercepts. Now, all of these terms mean the same thing, and they all mean to find the two spots or the two numbers where that quadratic graph touches the x-axis. That would be this spot and this spot. Now you're not always going to have two different numbers. Sometimes it'll look like this, where you have the graph touching just in the one spot there. Okay, but as long as you have an x-intercept, this formula will find it. Okay, this formula will find it. So let's take a look at an example. Okay, let's look at x squared plus 2x minus 3 equals 0. Now, of course, this is a quadratic equation, and we know that because we have an x squared term here, and that means it's a quadratic. But there are two really important things here. The first one is that this is in standard form. Okay, the x squared term is first, then you have the x term, and then just the number. Okay, so that is standard form. The second thing to note is that this is equal to 0. Okay, in order to use this quadratic formula, you have to set the equation equal to 0. So if there's going to be anything over here on this side, you're going to have to move it over to the other side and get all the terms on the same side of the equal sign in order to solve. Okay, but seeing that both of those hold true for this equation, we're going to go ahead and start by solving. Now up here in the formula you see three variables, A, B, and C. So we need to identify what these are first. What are my A, B, and C numbers, my values? Okay, so looking at this equation here, we're going to have an A, a B, and a C value. Okay, and when you're using this formula, the A value is always going to refer to the number that's attached to this x squared term here. Okay, the very first one. And since we just have x squared, there's not a number there, we can put on our math glasses and see this invisible 1 right there in front of that x squared, that invisible number. And so that's going to tell us that our A value is going to be 1. Okay. Now the B value is always going to be the value, the number attached to just the x term, not x squared, just the x. Okay, so from this we can see our B value is going to be 2. And finally, the C value is going to be the value that's just the lonely number. He doesn't have any variables. Okay, and so from this equation we see that our C value is -3. Now that we've identified all the values, all I'm going to do is use the quadratic equation and plug it in. Okay, so let's go ahead and rewrite the quadratic equation so we have something to work with. It's x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a. Okay, and now that we have that equation to work with, we're going to start plugging in numbers. So here I'm going to rewrite the equation with the substitutions. Okay, now it starts with a negative and then the b term. So inside this parentheses, where we have the b, we're going to use the value that b actually is. And we can see from our identifier here that we've identified b as 2. So we're going to put a 2 there. Okay, and then we're going to keep going with the equation. The next thing is this plus and minus sign. Okay, so plus or minus the square root of, next thing is b squared, so what's the b term? It's going to be 2 from right here, okay, squared minus 4 times my a term, a is 1, times my c term, and c is going to be negative 3. Okay, so there's the top of my equation, and I still need this fraction line here, so I can put the 2a at the bottom, and so here's my 2, and then the a term is going to be 1. Okay, and now I've completed the substitution step for my quadratic, so I have the equation ready to go. The next step is simply to simplify it. Okay, we have to do all the multiplications and additions and all that. Okay, and it can be lengthy, but eventually when you do it enough, you're going to be able to simplify these down fairly quickly and get to a result. So let's continue to simplify this equation and see where our intercepts are. Okay, so we're going to simplify here, and here I have a negative and in parentheses 2, and I don't really need these parentheses, so I'm going to go ahead and remove them. So it's going to be x equals negative 2 plus or minus, and then we're going to make our square root symbol. And then up here in my square root I have a 2 squared, and I know that that's just going to be 2 times 2, and my 2 squared is going to be 4, so I'm going to put a 4 right there. Okay, and next we have minus and then this whole term. Okay, now I know that 4 times 1 is 4, and then 4 times negative 3 is going to be negative 12, so I'm going to put a minus negative 12 there. Okay, and all of that divided by 2 times 1, okay, the bottom here, and that's just going to be 2. Okay, so let's take another step and simplify it down further. So x equals negative 2 plus or minus the square root, and here, now inside the square root we have 4 minus a negative 12. And we know that when we see this minus a negative, it's just going to turn into a plus sign, so we'll end up with 4 plus 12. So I can simplify what's inside this radical, this square root term, down to the square root of 16, and all divided by 2. Okay, and let's take it even further. So we're going to keep going here. X equals negative 2 plus or minus, and here I'm actually going to get rid of this square root of 16 because I know what that is. The square root of 16 is actually 4. Okay, and you can use your calculator to do that, no problem. Okay, and divided by 2. Now, here's where we really dig into it, okay? Remember, when we talked about these quadratics, we talked about how you're going to have 2 solutions. We're solving for the zeros, roots, solutions, solution sets, or x-intercepts, and those are all the same thing. And it means these 2 spots where that graph touches my x-axis. Okay, so I'm actually going to end up with 2 answers. So how do I get those 2 answers? Well, that's where this funky little plus or minus sign comes in here, because this is actually 2 expressions. Okay, the first expression is going to be the x equals negative 2 plus 4 over 2, and the second expression is going to be x equals negative 2 minus 4 over 2. Okay, so that's how I'm going to get my 2 different answers. Once we've simplified it enough all the way down, we can actually split this, and one of them is going to be a positive, and one of the equations is going to be a negative. So now that we've done that, we can finish the simplification down to a number, actually, or a fraction. So this negative 2 is going to turn, plus 4 is going to turn into positive 2 over 2, which is just going to equal 1. So that's one of my roots, my solution. Okay, and then over here we have x equals negative 2 minus 4 over 2. And I know that x equals, we know that negative 2 minus 4 is going to give us a negative 6. And that's going to be divided by 2 here. Okay, so we can simplify this fraction one more time. So let's go ahead and simplify and reduce that fraction, and we'll get negative 3. Okay, negative 3. So that's my second answer. And that's it. That's using the quadratic formula. Now let's take a look at one more example just for fluency. Okay. So this time we're going to look at the example 2x squared minus 3x minus 5 equals 0. Okay. So first thing, we need to know what A, what B, and what C are. Okay, we need to know what those three variables are going to be for this equation. Okay, so let's take a look. A is always going to be the number attached to my x squared term. Okay, and the number of my x squared term here is not 1, it's going to be a 2. Okay, so my A value is going to be 2. Now we need the B value, and we know that the B value comes from the x term, okay, the x with the power of 1. So here I'm looking at my B value, and it looks to be negative 3. Now make sure when you're doing this that you take the sign with it, okay, or that'll mess you up. So B is actually going to be negative 3. And the C value here is going to be negative 5. Okay. The C value is always just the number by itself. Now that I have those three variables, I'm going to go ahead and write down the formula that I'm using. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2a. So now that I have my formula, we can go ahead and substitute these variables in. Okay, so let's get started. X equals negative, and then the b term here is going to be negative 3. Okay, so negative 3 inside the parentheses. Now it's important to note, this negative is coming from the formula. You can't get rid of that. It has to be there. Okay, it's coming from the formula. And the negative inside the parentheses with the 3 is coming from the actual value, what b is. Okay, so make sure you have both the negatives. And then it's plus or minus the square root of b squared, or negative 3 squared, minus 4 times a would be 2, times c would be negative 5. All divided by 2 times a. My a value is going to be 2. Okay, so now that we have substituted all of our variables in, we're going to go ahead and simplify this thing down. Okay. Now, this is going to require doing something here with this first term, okay, the negative b term. And right now what I have is a negative, and in parentheses negative 3. And that's really going to be a negative 1 times negative 3. Okay, if you put your math glasses on, you can see this negative 1 hiding out right in front of that negative sign. Okay, right behind it. So negative 1 times negative 3, we know a negative times a negative is a positive. So all that's going to serve to do is change that term to positive 3. Okay. And then we're going to continue with plus or minus the square root. Here, the first term is going to be my negative 3 squared. Now remember, as a small sidebar, negative 3 squared with no parentheses, this negative sign isn't included in that. Okay, it's not included. So that is going to yield a negative 9. But since we're substituting something in here, okay, it goes inside parentheses to help you know that that negative is part of the 3. So really what we're looking at is negative 3 squared, which is negative 3 times negative 3. And a negative times negative is a positive, so that's going to yield positive 9. Okay, so right here, simplification for this negative 3 squared term is going to be a positive 9. And then it's minus, and we have 4 times 2 is 8. Okay, so 8 times negative 5, that's going to give me negative 40. All divided by 2 times 2. So that's 4. Okay. Now we're going to keep going with our simplification and do another step. Now this term isn't really going to simplify anymore. Right now we're primarily working with what's inside the radical here. So we're just going to copy it down. 3 plus or minus. And then the square root. Now if we look at what's inside this radical, I have 9 minus a negative 40. And we know anytime we have minus a negative, we can just go ahead and turn those into a positive sign. So we have 9 plus 40. And that's going to put 49 inside the radical. And then we're going to divide the whole thing by 4, just like what we have right here. Okay. One more step. 3 plus or minus. And we're still looking at the radical here because it can still be simplified one more time. Okay, and that radical, that square root of 49, if you use your calculator, you'll see that it's 7. Okay, and divided by 4. Now this is going to be the part where we split our signs here into two answers. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. One of them is going to be x equals 3 plus 7 over 4. And the other one is going to be x equals 3 minus 7 over 4. Okay. And then we can simplify both of these independently to get what the actual answer is. Okay, the most simplified form. So 3 plus 7 is 10 divided by 4. So this is going to equal x equals 10 over 4. And if we reduce that fraction, we'll get x equals 5 halves. Okay, and that's going to be one of my answers. One of my intercepts, my zeros, my roots, my solutions. Okay. And if we look at this one, x equals 3 minus 7, that's going to give me a negative 4 over a positive 4. And this fraction is just going to reduce to x equals negative 1. Okay, so there's my other root, my solution. And these two together, this negative 1 and this 5 halves, make my solution set, okay, the set of intercepts for that quadratic equation. All right, now let's take a look at one more example, but this time we're going to take a look at a curveball. Okay, what could be much more difficult. So let's take a look at the quadratic equation x squared plus 4x equals negative 2. Now, this is where we're going to run into a problem where one of our two requirements doesn't hold. Actually, both of them don't. This quadratic equation is not in standard form, and it's not equal to 0. So we can make it be in standard form, and we can force it to equal 0 by moving this 2 here to the other side. So let's go ahead and move this 2 to the other side of the equal sign to get all of our terms on the same side of the equal sign. Okay. So in order to move this term, I have to utilize inverse operations and add 2 to both sides of the equation. Okay. And negative 2 plus 2 is just going to give me 0. So I'm going to end up with x squared plus 4x plus 2 equals 0. And now both of our requirements have been met. Okay, this is in standard form, and it is equal to 0. So let's identify what our a, b, and c values actually are here. Okay, if we look at this, our a value, again, is always going to come from the x squared term, the number that's with it. And I don't see one there, which means if I put my math glasses on, I can see an invisible 1 sitting right there. Okay, which means my a is going to be 1. B here is going to be positive 4, again, the number that's attached to my x term. Okay, so that's going to be positive 4. And c is going to be positive 2. Positive 2. All right, let's write down the equation, the formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And now that we have the formula, we can substitute in. Okay, so we're going to substitute here. X equals negative, our b term is going to be 4 plus or minus the square root of 4 squared minus 4. A is going to be 1 and c is going to be 2. All divided by 2 times a, 1. So let's go ahead and keep going and simplify this down. Okay, this negative and 4 in the parentheses is just going to give me a negative 4 plus or minus the square root of, here I have 4 squared, which is 16. 4 times 4 is 16. Minus 4 times 1 is 4 times 2, that's going to give me 8. All divided by 2 times 1, or 2. Okay. And another step. X equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root, and here we're going to finish simplifying what's under the radical. So 16 minus 8 is just going to give me 8 under the radical there, divided by 2. Now, we see kind of a problem approaching here. This guy, this 8, the square root of 8, is not going to be a pretty number. Okay, it's going to end up being 2.6 something or whatever. Okay, but it's not going to give me a whole number. So this is where I have to know how to simplify this radical. Okay, so if we look at simplifying this radical, let's look at 8 and find its prime factorization. Okay, if I divide 8 by 2, 2 is a prime number, I'm going to get 4, and that's just going to be 2 times 2. Okay, so let's keep going with our prime factorization here. Now that I know that the prime factorization of 8 is 2 times 2 times 2, I can change that radical. Instead of having an 8 in here, we can put the prime factorization, 2 times 2 times 2. And one of our rules with radicals is if in the prime factorization, if we have any pairs, they get to become one number and come out. Okay, so this is going to simplify to 2 square roots of 2. So this is what I'm going to replace right up here with this square root of 8. Okay, so we're going to get x, going back to the quadratic simplification, we're going to get x is negative 4 plus or minus 2 square roots of 2 divided by 2. Now, here it becomes a little tricky. We can do another simplification here, but really a lot of people will accept this, and if you put this in the calculator, you're going to get a decimal. Okay, so really what it's going to come out to be is x equals negative 4 plus 2 square root of 2 over 2, and x equals negative 4 minus 2 square root of 2 over 2. And the last simplification step we can do, since both terms up here are divisible by 2, it's just going to turn into x equals negative 2 plus the square root of 2, and x equals negative 2 minus the square root of 2. Okay, and again, what I did there was I divided this 4 by 2 and this 2 by 2 to get the 1. Okay. All right, and that's going to be it. Those are my roots, my solutions, my x-intercepts, or the solution set.